Welcome to the debate. Imagine a market where the price of the product triples, but you literally cannot choose to stop buying it.
Right. You can't just opt out.
Exactly. You can't opt out. I mean, if the price of a luxury car or a high-end smartphone goes through the roof, you just walk away. You keep driving your old car or you buy a cheaper phone. But then you step into the world of the American housing market today, and, well, suddenly that power to simply walk away vanishes. You can't opt out of needing a roof over your head.
Yeah, because we biologically need a place to sleep. So all those standard economic rules just they go out the window. It is desperation, not a negotiation. The biological necessity of shelter completely short-circuits the traditional economic equation of choice.
It really does. And that fundamental inability to walk away brings us to the core of the American housing debate. We are looking at a market that is currently under profound structural strain. I mean, it's defined by skyrocketing costs across the country, historic inventory shortages, and this widening, highly visible wealth gap between those who own homes and those who are just stuck renting.
The strain is undeniably there. Everyone feels it. I think the disagreement is really about how we diagnose the root of that strain and consequently what medicine we prescribe to fix it.
Right, which brings us to the central question we are exploring today, drawn directly from our source material. Does the solution to this housing crisis lie in treating shelter as a financial asset governed by market freedom and property rights? Or must we treat it as foundational infrastructure protected by human rights?
It's a huge question.
It is. I will be arguing from the market freedom philosophy. My position is that this crisis is not a failure of free markets or capitalism. It is a crisis of artificial scarcity caused directly by heavy-handed government intervention, and the path forward is deregulation.
And I will be arguing the human right philosophy, because demand for housing is inelastic. Again, you can't just opt out. It is a basic human necessity that's uniquely vulnerable to exploitation. So I'll be making the case that market forces alone cannot solve this, and that we require a robust, decommodified social safety net.
Well, let's get right into the mechanics of this scarcity, because I know what people are thinking when they hear the word deregulation.
Yeah, they picture greedy developers bulldozing charming neighborhoods, right?
Exactly.
Bulldozers and skyscrapers everywhere, but the reality on the ground is entirely different. The housing crisis is a failure of over-regulation, and the smoking gun here is municipal exclusionary zoning laws.
You're talking about the local ordinances that dictate exactly what can be built and where.
Right. In major American cities right now, local laws mandate what's called single-family lot sizes. This legally bans high-density housing, so things like duplexes, townhomes, and apartment buildings, on up to 75% of residential land.
Wow.
Yeah, think about that. On 3/4 of the land in our most productive cities, it is a criminal offense to build anything other than a detached, single-family home with a yard.
And that 75% figure is staggering when you map it out over a massive metropolitan area like Los Angeles or Seattle. It completely paralyzes the city. The consequence of that zoning restriction is that capital is legally blocked from flowing to where demand is highest. You have millions of people wanting to live in urban centers where the jobs are. You have developers with the capital, willing to spend the money to build homes for those people. And then you have local government standing in the middle saying, no, you cannot build a fourplex here because it ruins the character of the neighborhood.
The nebulous neighborhood character defense.
Exactly. If we remove these artificial government-imposed barriers, developers can actually build supply. When supply floods the market, natural competition forces costs down. We don't have a capitalism problem. We have a supply problem choked by local regulations.
I hear the supply argument, I really do. But you are treating housing as if it behaves like a standard widget in a textbook supply and demand graph. And I'm sorry, but I don't buy that.
Why not?
Let me tell you why. Because of that biological desperation we talked about earlier, what we are seeing right now is what the materialist identifies as the financialization of shelter.
Walk me through what that actually looks like in practice. Because to a developer, building a house and selling it is just a business transaction. It's pretty straightforward.
But it's no longer just builders and families making transactions. That's the issue. It's Wall Street. Private equity firms and massive institutional investors have looked at this inelastic demand and realized something critical. Housing is an incredibly safe, inflation-proof, yield-generating asset.
Sure, it's a solid investment.
It's more than that, though. Over recent years, institutional investors have purchased roughly 25% of single-family homes sold in this country. 1 in 4.
Okay, but they are buying them to rent them out, which still puts housing on the market. It's not like the homes sit empty.
Right, but look at how they do it. A private equity firm looks at a neighborhood in, say, Atlanta or Phoenix. They deploy algorithms to identify undervalued homes, and they swoop in with all-cash bids, sight unseen. They completely bypass the traditional mortgage process.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, a young couple trying to buy their first home with a 20% down conventional loan literally cannot compete against a multi-billion-dollar fund paying cash in 7 days. And once Wall Street owns these properties, they aggressively raise rents to maximize returns for their shareholders. The market will always prioritize investor returns over community stability. So deregulation doesn't fix that. It just gives private equity a freer hand to extract wealth from working-class neighborhoods.
Wait, if you're arguing that Wall Street is buying up single-family homes because there's a shortage of them, isn't the most obvious solution to just build more homes?
To a degree, yes, but
Let's dive into how the private market actually solves affordability when it's allowed to function. I want to talk about filtering.
The trickle-down theory of housing. This is where you tell me that building a luxury high-rise somehow helps a minimum wage worker.
I know. If you're listening to this, you might be rolling your eyes because it does sound exactly like trickle-down economics. But let's use a different market as an analogy to see how it works on the ground. Think about the used car market.
Okay, used cars.
Right. No one expects a brand new Honda Civic to cost $5,000. Low-income drivers buy used cars, but imagine if the government made it illegal to manufacture new cars. What would happen?
Well, prices would spike.
Exactly. Millionaires wouldn't stop driving. They would start bidding up the prices of 10-year-old used Civics. Suddenly, a beat-up sedan costs $40,000, and the low-income driver is priced out completely.
Because the wealthy always win a bidding war for a scarce resource.
Yes, that is exactly what is happening in housing. When a developer builds a brand new, high-end apartment complex, high-income renters move into those new units. But crucially, they move out of older housing stock. They leave their 20-year-old apartments.
Opening up those units.
Right. As those middle-tier and older buildings experience vacancies, the landlords of those older buildings are suddenly forced to compete for tenants. They have to lower rents or offer concessions. So building luxury units absolutely makes housing more affordable for everyone else by freeing up the existing supply.
Okay, I understand the theory of filtering, and the used car analogy is helpful to a point. In a vacuum, filtering does occur. High-income earners move to the shiny new building, and the 20-year-old building becomes a bit cheaper. But here is where the math falls apart.
Go ahead.
Filtering as our primary policy completely fails at the floor of the market. Let's look at the mathematical reality presented in our source material. Suppose you have a family that, based on their wages, can only afford $500 a month for rent.
That's a highly vulnerable demographic, sure, but they exist in every major city.
Right. Now run the numbers for a private developer looking at an empty lot. Between the cost of land acquisition, skyrocketing lumber and materials, construction labor, property taxes, and insurance, there is no unsubsidized private builder on earth who can construct or even operate a unit at a $500 a month price point.
Because the costs are just too high.
exactly. The physical costs of the concrete and the plumbing exceed the revenue. The profit margins do not exist, so even if filtering works perfectly at the top, it evaporates before it reaches the bottom. Private developers will never build housing for the lowest income brackets because the math strictly prevents it.
So your argument is that the supply-only approach has a hard floor it just can't drop below. How does the human right philosophy address that mathematical gap?
By acknowledging that where the private market fails, the public sector must step in. If a family can only afford $500 and it costs $1,500 to operate the unit, the only fix is massive government intervention. We need direct government construction of social housing and a massive expansion of Section 8 vouchers to bridge that gap.
Massive government spending, essentially.
But furthermore, even if filtering works eventually,
People are drowning right now. We can't tell a single mother to wait 10 years for a luxury apartment to filter down to her price bracket. She needs a shield today. This is why the human right philosophy relies on immediate local protections, specifically price controls like rent stabilization and just cause eviction protections.
Okay, I have to push back fiercely on that. Rent control is arguably one of the most thoroughly studied and universally discredited policies in modern economics. It is a disaster disguised as compassion.
Discredited by economists who prioritize market efficiency over human displacement. If Wall Street is aggressively hiking rents, we need a tourniquet. Rent stabilization stops a private equity firm from buying a building and raising the rent by 40% overnight just to force tenants out.
I get the emotional appeal, but let's dig into why rent control acts as an absolute ceiling on housing quality and supply. It's not about abstract efficiency, it's about the underlying math of building maintenance.
Okay, let's hear the math.
Let's say you own a small duplex. The city caps your rent increases at 2% a year. But inflation is running at 5%. The plumber you need to fix a leak just raised his hourly rate by 15%. Your property taxes went up 8%. Your costs are exploding, but your revenue is legally frozen. What happens?
Well, you're assuming landlords are operating on razor-thin margins rather than just extracting maximum allowable profit.
I'm assuming landlords respond logically to basic math. When the math breaks, the landlord literally cannot afford the new roof or the new boiler, so they patch it cheaply. They opt out of routine maintenance. The building slowly rots. You aren't protecting housing. You're putting it on life support. Or, even worse for your goals, the landlord decides the rental market is just too hostile, so they convert those apartments into luxury condos, sell them off entirely, and permanently remove them from the rental supply.
But the alternative is the unrestricted market, which I view as a distortion of human priority. I mean, if a neighborhood is gentrifying rapidly, the absence of rent control means a complete demographic wipeout of working-class people. You talk about the math of plumbing, but what about the family that has lived in a community for 3 generations being priced out so a tech worker can have a pied-à-terre?
I'm not ignoring them, but rent control operates exactly like putting a lid on a boiling pot without turning down the heat. It fiercely protects a very small, lucky group of current tenants who happen to be in those units right now, but at the direct and severe expense of future renters and newcomers.
How does it hurt newcomers?
Developers look at a city with strict rent controls and say, I'm not going to build there. My investment is legally capped, so the capital goes to another state, no new housing is built, and the shortage worsens. You exacerbate the exact scarcity you are trying to solve.
See, the human right philosophy argues that community continuity and human dignity have a value that supersedes maximizing the efficiency of property development. You cannot treat people's homes like an optimized stock portfolio.
But you also cannot freeze a city in amber. Cities are dynamic. If you block new development and freeze rents, you just turn the city into an exclusive country club where only the wealthy can afford the entry fee of buying a non-rent-controlled home. This is why the federal policy focus of the market freedom approach is so vital. We want to flood the market with supply, and to do that, we have to tackle NIMBYism.
Right, the not in my backyard crowd. Homeowners blocking new development.
Yes. And we need to be clear about what NIMBYism actually is. It's a handful of passengers on a life raft actively puncturing holes in other boats, so theirs stays the most valuable.
That's a harsh way to put it, but yeah.
It's true, though. Local homeowners who already have their housing will almost always vote to restrict new supply in their neighborhood. Why? Because restricting supply artificially inflates the value of their own homes. It's a massive, localized conflict of interest.
Ironically, this is one area where wealthy homeowners manipulate regulations to protect their own capital, which is a distortion we both agree is harmful.
Exactly. So the federal or state government needs to step in and actively strip local NIMBYs of their veto power. You cannot block a high-density development just because it might create some traffic or change your neighborhood's character. And we need to pair that with expanding federal tax incentives for private builders, Programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC.
And just for the listener, LIHT is essentially the government giving tax breaks to private developers on the condition that they designate a certain percentage of their new units as affordable housing.
Exactly. It leverages the efficiency of the private sector by making it slightly more profitable to build for lower income brackets. If we break the NIMBY veto and expand those builder incentives, the market becomes fluid and prices drop naturally.
While stripping the NIMBY veto is necessary, I'll give you that, but relying on tax credits to coax developers into doing the right thing is vastly insufficient. Let's look at the alternative federal policy focus under the human right philosophy, which actually addresses the floor of the market we discussed earlier. It's called the Housing First framework. And despite how it's often portrayed, it is actually the most fiscally prudent approach we have.
Wait, fiscally prudent? Guaranteeing federal rental assistance and unconditionally housing the unhoused sounds like an astronomical budget line item.
It sounds that way until you look at the real math of chronic homelessness. The Housing First concept is built on providing permanent, unconditional housing to the unhoused population immediately, before requiring them to get sober, before requiring them to secure employment or resolve mental health issues. Give them a key and a locked door first.
Which, as we know, traditionally receives heavy pushback because people feel it removes the incentive for rehabilitation. They view it as a handout without accountability.
It does receive pushback, usually on those moralistic grounds, but the data points in a completely different direction. Study after study in our material shows that leaving someone on the street is astronomically expensive for the taxpayer.
Because of the emergency services.
Exactly. Consider what happens when someone is unhoused. They are exposed to the elements, violence, disease. They frequently utilize emergency room services for basic care. They experience jail stays for vagrancy or minor infractions. The sheer amount of policing, legal processing, and municipal resources required to manage street-level homelessness is just staggering.
The systemic toll is undeniable. Emergency rooms are the most expensive form of healthcare on the planet.
They are. And the data proves that chronic homelessness costs taxpayers significantly more in those emergency and punitive services than the direct upfront cost of simply providing a stable apartment. When you give someone a foundation, a locked door, a shower, a place to sleep safely, their emergency room visits plummet, their interactions with law enforcement drop to near zero. By treating housing as a guaranteed right, as foundational infrastructure rather than a reward for economic productivity, we actually save the system money. It is cheaper to house them than to police them.
I see the logic in the Housing First data. Treating symptoms through emergency rooms is incredibly inefficient, and a street-level crisis is essentially a permanent citywide emergency room scenario. But I would argue that Housing First is a triage mechanism for the absolute most extreme edge of the crisis. It is not a structural fix for the broader housing market that affects the other 99% of the population.
But it is a structural fix if the underlying philosophy scales up. If our end goal is a decommodified social safety net, then profit must become secondary to shelter at every level. We guarantee federal rental assistance so that the single mother working minimum wage isn't waiting for a luxury apartment to filter down. She is housed today, securely, without the constant threat of a private equity firm pricing her out.
Let's synthesize our positions as we look at these two wildly diverging paths for the future of American housing. The market freedom vision is fundamentally about abundance. I believe that a fluid, high-supply commodity market is the only engine powerful enough to naturally drop prices at a societal scale. By stripping away exclusionary zoning, defeating the NIMBY life raft mentality, and allowing private capital to actually compete, we replace artificial, government-imposed scarcity with true housing abundance.
And the human right vision is fundamentally about security. I believe that. Because shelter is an inelastic human need, it will always be exploited by financialization if left entirely to the whims of the free market. You cannot negotiate when your life depends on it. Our vision relies on a robust social safety net, massive public investment, and strict local protections against wealth extraction, ensuring that community stability is never sacrificed for Wall Street yields.
I think where we reach a strong point of convergence, and where the source material is unequivocal, is the recognition that the current housing infrastructure is fundamentally failing. The status quo is a disaster. It is failing the future renters who are completely priced out of ever achieving homeownership, and it is brutally failing the most vulnerable populations who are pushed onto the street.
We absolutely agree on the diagnosis of a failing system. The tension remains entirely on the cure. You see private capital and deregulation as the cure. I see unchecked capital and the financialization of our neighborhoods as the very disease that necessitates robust public intervention.
It is a profound complexity, trying to balance the established American tradition of property rights with the undeniable moral weight of civil rights. We opened by talking about how housing isn't like a luxury car or a smartphone. You can't just walk away from the market when the price is too high.
Because you can't walk away from the human need for shelter.
Exactly. And understanding how raw structural economics collide with those deeply visceral human stakes is the only way we can begin to untangle this crisis. There's so much more to explore in the material regarding these policies, and we invite our listeners to examine it further to form their own conclusions. Thank you for joining us for this incredibly vital discussion. We will see you next time.